A bit of trivia to begin today. What movie won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in the year 1942? I switched movies on you. Citizen Kane, that is correct. Now, anytime there's a movie that wins awards like that, and one like Citizen Kane, which is talked about as one of the best movies ever, I always feel like I gotta go watch it. Now, I watched Citizen Kane, and I didn't get it. Later today, I'm going to read a paper about Citizen Kane because my oldest is a freshman in college, and he had to write a paper on it, and wants me to proofread it for him. And I think he gets it, but I didn't get it. And I say this because movies come at a time, right? They come out in a particular cultural context. What was happening in 1942? World War II. That would have consumed all of the country's energy, right? And not just for those that were away, but that was actually a war where we sacrificed. And so if you were at home, you had things you were dealing with. And if you wrote a screenplay that won a movie in 1942, you probably grew up during what? The Depression. So you've got all of this cultural stuff that shapes you, that when you're telling stories, that comes out, and all people that are experiencing that story hear that as well. And I think what movies do is they give us opportunities to express our anxieties and our fears, as well as our hopes and our dreams. And all of that is particular to the context that we're in. Now, some stories are more timeless than others. That's why we keep reading the Bible, right? It continues to tell us the truth about human beings. And my son clearly finds Citizen Kane to be more timeless than I do. But it certainly had a cultural time that it was the movie, right? So nowadays, what are the movies that seem to be the big blockbusters that they keep making more and more of all the time? Superhero movies. And Star Wars is a good one. That's also kind of superhero-ish. But superhero movies have a particular way they unfold. There is some kind of unspeakable or unmanageable evil that you can't imagine anybody being able to solve or get past. And then the hero comes along that against all odds has special powers that is able to overcome that sort of seemingly unconquerable foe. Now, in our world, do we have any problems that seem unsolvable? A whole bunch of them, right? In a global economy, you can talk about economics, you can talk about ethnic conflict, you can talk about all kinds of stuff. And all of it seems too big to solve. So, we need some superheroes. And because they don't seem to be evidently rising up among us, we make movies. And those movies then sort of give voice to our fear, but also voice to our hopes. Now, the first superheroes I remember seeing on the screen were the original, like 1960s Batman on reruns when I was a kid, with all of the Kablam and comic things that popped up on the screen. And I remember watching Wonder Woman, but the one that really sucked me in was Christopher Reeves playing Superman in all three, 1, 2, and 3 movies, right? And the other thing about Christopher Reeve's Superman, though, was he was a very lonely guy. He had come from a planet, so all of his people were gone. He had that ice palace where he could go visit like the holograms of his parents that would talk to him. But then he was different than human beings. And even though he had a relationship with Lois Lane, it wasn't like the same kind of human relationship that we have. And he carried all of this burden of saving humanity. And it was a lonely space. In fact, I think it was in the second movie when he lets go of his humanity, or his superpowers, and just becomes a human. There's a scene where he's in like a diner and he gets in a fight with a guy that punches him and his lip starts bleeding because he's now a human. But then the unspeakable evil comes again and he has to go back to being the superhero, so he has to go back to that place of loneliness. Today we hear this amazing story of Easter, but if you back up where we were on Thursday and go through that whole passion story, I think it's a story that's filled with loneliness. You start off with Judas betraying Jesus. Now, Judas was one of the 12, and maybe all the people in the community would look at that whole group and just see them as a whole. But do you think Judas felt like part of the group entirely? No. Otherwise, he couldn't have did what he did, probably. And then there's the people that paid him to betray Jesus. Did they want him in their crowd? No. Probably not. He was just a tool for them. So Judas, no doubt, was a lonely guy. Now Peter is part of the 12, and he's got a special leadership role there, and no doubt is connected with all of that. But after he betrays Jesus, do you think he felt lonely? After he says, no, I don't know that guy. Now there were other disciples that ran away as well, but I would bet that Peter went home thinking he was worse than the rest of them because he said it out loud 3 times, just as Jesus told him he was going to do. And then you get to some of the bad guys in the story, like Pilate, who sits between the emperor and the subjugated peoples. That's got to be a lonely place to be. And Herod the king, who is technically Hebrew, but now is working for the emperor as well as the local sort of governor king. That must have been a lonely place. But then there's all the rest of the disciples of Jesus. Do we all agree the same way? No. And so anytime some tragedy happens in our family or in our community, we can find ourselves in our own places of our own kind of grief and loneliness and feeling disconnected from other people. And so I would bet that all of those people that followed Jesus in those couple of days before he was raised were very lonely in places of their own grief and struggle. Now we as people live with that same kind of loneliness. All through the seasons of Advent and Lent, we have been collecting prayers. First they were on a subway wall, and then those subway wall pieces became this cross and this tree. And then we've been collecting leaves on this tree of prayers. And if you read those leaves, there is a whole lot of loneliness. There's a prayer that just says, I pray for my life, Lord. There's a prayer for sobriety to stay. There are prayers that we don't even know what they mean, right? They're just initials or names. And in all of that, you can bet that there is a whole bunch of loneliness that is just all gathered up on the leaves of that tree. Now, as a pastor, I will tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've had someone come and struggle to tell me the great burden that they carry. And it's often a lonely burden. And I always have to brace myself because I think it's going to be something like super, super bad, like murder with tax evasion and like just a whole bunch of things. And then they tell me, and I don't mean to make light of it, I'm always like sort of like, oh, that's all. But it's usually for them something that's terrible, and the reason partly that it's terrible is because they've been carrying it all along. I had someone once tell me as they got to this church for the first time that their life was a total mess and that no one else here could understand it because we all had our lives together. We're laughing, right? And the thing is, their journey is we all have our own journey, but that journey was not a whole lot different from several others in this place. But we have been conditioned to not talk about those things and to be independent and to pull up our bootstraps and suck it up and be tough. And so we don't share all of those things. And if I could get us all together in one place and just run down the lists of burdens that we carry on our own and have people raise their hands, you would find out that we have a whole lot more in common in our burdens and struggle and suffering than you think we do. And this is where Jesus coming to the cross is so important. He could have died in a whole crowd of people, but he died all by himself. There were 2 other guys there, but they weren't the ones getting mocked. They were actually one of them mocking Jesus as well. And it's in that loneliness of the cross that he meets us in probably some of the deepest, darkest places that we end up as people. When we feel like we're all alone and there is no one around us. And yet, even before we get to Easter, there's a hint of what God is up to. Even as Peter says no and runs away and Judas is off cashing in, there's a group of people that is still within sight of the cross, hanging in there as Jesus dies. And who's that group? The women. And in the Gospel of Luke, on that morning, it is a group of women, not just one, a group that comes. And who do they encounter in the tomb? Angels. How many? 2, right? Not just one. So built into this gospel story is community. From the beginning, even before the resurrection, there's a group of women hanging in there with Jesus. The same group of women shows up to care for his body, but they are the ones that then get to tell this story of resurrection. When Peter finds out, he runs all by himself, right? Not a community, but he goes back to community eventually, and then you see all of that start to unfold. And if you keep reading in the New Testament, it's all about community. They were told in the book of Acts that they gathered and they prayed together and they read scripture together and they worshiped together. We're told that they gathered all things in common and then gave to each as need. Now, this doesn't mean community isn't messy. At one point they were neglecting some widows, and they had to sort through that together. But they were living in community. And all of that starts in this place of resurrection where new life comes, not just as new life for us as individuals, but new life for us as a whole. This is why when Paul talks about the church, he calls it the body of? We're a whole body. And is your body, Paul says this, is your body whole? Is it all eyes or all hands or all? Nope, right? It's all of that diversity. And so we have been gifted with this community. This is in part what happens in the resurrection. Jesus dies and is raised into new life to make us right with God, which gives us a right community with God, but then that right community lives within us as the church. Now, our culture is a deeply lonely place, and you know this because our superhero movies these days have a particular variety to them. Not only do they have the unsolvable problems and the heroes, but these days, how many superheroes are in a movie? A bunch. Every once in a while you'll get just one, but more and more, whether it's a DC or a Marvel movie, there's a whole bunch of heroes in there, and they all have to work together to solve the problem. I think this is our culture telling us that our culture has a loneliness issue, that as connected as we can be, we often are in a crowd of people all by ourselves. And so our superhero movies tell us this, but it turns out that we've been telling a story for 2,000 years that is about new life and community. So if our world, with all of these unsolvable problems, needs heroes, and we have been given a story that is about life and community, who are those heroes going to be? Us. God has already put their heroes here. The body of Christ has always been that space of community that gathers in the lost and the lonely, the least and the last, the people that are suffering, and then we are sent out into the world to gather more in and sent out into the world to gather more in because of this gift of life we have been given. I don't know that we always think of ourselves as heroes, and maybe we should have a little bit of Christian humility to not go like putting on superhero costumes and running out to save the world like that. But it doesn't mean we don't take that love with us everywhere we go. And it's a gift to us that we share. So may we be blessed to be so full of love that it spills out of us into the world around us and continues to build community in bigger and bigger circles until we have gathered up the whole of God's creation. Amen.